The video you're about to watch is a guest class or guest lecture that I gave in the School of Advanced Social Studies. I was invited by the lecturer, Sinisha Pekevsky. Owing to time constraints, normally I couldn't touch upon everything I had in mind to. And I would like to take this opportunity of 5-10 minutes introduction to kind of point you in a few directions, and then we head straight to the lecture. Throughout human history, populations were on the move, and as they were on the move, they had to interact with each other. Sometimes the direction of the immigration was surprising. For example, colonialism was a form of reverse immigration. But there's one interesting question, and it has to do with conflicts. Why is it that so many conflicts are among like-minded people or similar people? For example, internecine wars, civil wars, wars among the same ethnicity, or the same race, or whites on whites, blacks on blacks. Why do we have this situation where the more similar people are, the more likely they are to engage in conflict, or what Freud called the narcissism of small differences? Masahiro Mori, the Japanese roboticist, coined the phrase uncanny valley reaction to describe the discomfort that people would feel when robots become indistinguishable from humans. And perhaps this serves to explain, perhaps this is part of the reason. The topic of today's lecture is intercultural communication, distinguished from cross-cultural communication. Cross-cultural communication has to do with the differences between cultures as a whole, whereas intercultural communications is a pragmatic field which deals with how individuals from different cultures create a common language in order to somehow interact and obtain outcomes. I start the lecture by discussing the work of Adorno and Horkheimer in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment, and the work of Louis Althusser in his book Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. I say that all these scholars suggested that subjectivity, the sense of identity, is actually dictated by the media and the state. And therefore, what we call culture is the sum total of these influences known as interpellations. There are hidden assumptions. When we discuss intercultural communication, there are several hidden assumptions. Assumption number one is that cultures are different, that intercultural communication is needed, and that it is beneficial. But cultures are not monolithic. Every culture has subcultures. There's the co-cultural theory of Mark Orbe, ORBE. Cultures are heterogeneous. Cultures are protean. They change all the time. And so it's wrong to confuse the question whether cultures are different with the question whether cultures are homogeneous. These are two separate questions. They have nothing to do with each other. And the fact is that this second wave of globalization has led to cultural convergence, has reduced cultural diversity, and has increased intercultural exposure or understanding. I suggest in the lecture a typology, a taxonomy of cultures. Shame and reputation-based cultures, which engage mostly in signaling. Solutions-orientated consensual cultures, which are focused on goals. And dominance or elimination cultures, cultures which are preoccupied with hegemony and genocide. The goals of intercultural communication are to foster respect among individuals which hail from different cultures, to create a kind of common language of dignity. So this involves communicative accommodation and what is known as code switching, when you adopt the other person's language in order to bridge the gap between you. There's a question of efficacy. Intercultural communication, for example, enhances business results. It involves cultural agility, cultural simulation, cultural sensitivity, and cultural adaptation. There's cultural fusion. the work of Eric Kramer, when an acculturated individual harbors, displays, and adheres to multiple cultures. A one-person multicultural organism. The components of intercultural communication are multiple: social attributes, thought patterns, sociocultural contexts, identity factors. And intercultural communication, as I mentioned, involves intercultural adaptation, intercultural competence, and communicative competence. Sometimes intercultural communication leads to conflict, actually. Not every type of intercultural communication is benevolent, benign, and beneficial. When intercultural communication is forced, when it is coerced, when people are told, instructed to engage in intercultural communication, or else, when there's a punitive element, of course, intercultural communication leads to conflict. When intercultural communication is the outcome of immigration, invasion, occupation, then of course this leads to conflict. Conflict could be axiological, over values, it could be doxastic, over beliefs, or it could be deontic, over the definition of what is right and what is wrong, the good life, ethical in a way. Language plays a huge part, and not only in terms of reference, what words mean, lexically and otherwise, the meaning of meanings theory. But this is only one aspect of the role of language in intercultural communication. The media of transmission are important. The interpretation of statements, utterances, words, speech acts, interpretation, the hermeneutic aspect is critical. All this leads, when language is used properly, it leads to acculturation, not assimilation, as Kim had observed. Collaboration results communicative acculturation. There are several mechanisms in intercultural communication. One of them is anxiolysis, the reduction of anxiety by ameliorating uncertainty. The more you get to know the other, the more you reduce alterity, the more certain you are and the less anxious. There's assimilation. I give an example of the Jews in the 19th century. There's deviance, rebellion, defiance, contumaciousness, essentially a psychopathic, antisocial reaction to attempts to integrate culturally or to communicate culturally. And finally, there's alienation, not in the Marxist sense. I refer to the work of Hajda and others. At the very end of the lecture, I mentioned the dominant model or theory in intercultural communication, the culture-based conflict situation models, several of them, proposed by Ting, Toomey, and Oetzel. These models deal with various aspects of intercultural communication: the primary orientation, the boundary features and conditions, the conflict communication factors, and the conflict competence. This theory, therefore, deals mainly with the type of intercultural communication that is conflictive or leads to conflict. By contrast, there is the intercultural praxis model suggested by Katie Sorrells. And this model deals with situations in intercultural communication that lead to, empathically and compassionately lead to further integration, further cooperation, good outcomes. So it's the optimistic model, if you wish. And it involves 6 stages: inquiry, framing, positioning of oneself, dialogue, reflection, and finally, positive action. Choose, according to your predilection, which of these 2 models fits better your view of the other, of othering, of the outsider, of the foreigner. If you are a xenophobe, if you are leery and wary of the other, you're likely to adopt the culture-based conflict situation models. If, on the other hand, you're a bit Pollyanna-ish and optimistic and believe in the essential goodness of people, you would probably adopt Sorrell's intercultural praxis model. And now, onward, Christian and, of course, Jewish soldiers, to the lecture in the School of Advanced Social Studies. Thank you and enjoy.
are presenting online. I have one professor from, I can say that he's Macedonian, but he's not Macedonian. He's half Macedonian now because he's married in Macedonia. But he's a very well known, when I say very well known, in the world manners, he's very well known professor. His name is Professor Dr. or Dr. Professor Sam Vaknin. He's professor on, okay, I will not.
I will present myself, don't worry.
Okay, okay, so I will give the floor now to the Professor Sam Vaknin. And later, of course, you can have time to interrupt him, because this is not just one-way communications, it's a two-way communication, which means if you have some question, please interrupt, ask Professor Sam Vaknin, because he's very knowledgeable and has a lot of information that I think it will be very useful for you. So, Professor Sam, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you for inviting me. And to reciprocate the compliments, I have known Sinisha for more than 15 years, 20 years almost. And you're very lucky to have him, in my view. My name is Sam Vaknin. Call me Sam for short. It will be much better use of the time. I'm a professor in Cambridge in the Commonwealth Institute of Advanced Professional Studies. I'm a professor of psychology and a professor of business management. So I have two hats, which makes me schizophrenic, I assume. Now, in 1961, the young president of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, went to Berlin. It was a very difficult time. Berlin was under siege by the Soviet Union. And Kennedy wanted to give the Germans a pep talk to lift up their spirits and to restore their resilience and resistance. So he stood on the stage in a crowded public venue and he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which could be reasonably translated as, "I'm a donut." Berliner is a donut in Germany. It's the name of a donut. Now, I think the Soviet Union got seriously worried about this statement because they were not trained to fight donuts. It is a fact, in any case, it's a fact that shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union lifted the siege on Berlin. And that was the first time in recorded history that a donut had the upper hand when confronted with a superpower. Of course, this is also an example of problems in intercultural communication, in cultural sensitivity, in intercultural competence. And we'll discuss all these concepts and all these issues a bit later. Now, let's start with a reductionist view of what constitutes culture. I'm sure there are many other professors at your school and outside your school who deal repeatedly and consistently and career long with the question of what is culture and mostly fail. In the 19th century and in the 20th century, there were attempts to define culture in a reductive view, in a reductionist view, to go to the elements, to the base elements of culture. And I will mention two such attempts. One by Adorno and Horkheimer. They suggested that the subjectivity of people, who they are, their identity, and especially their cultural identity, has to do with the media, with the mass media. The mass media shape the identity of people. And then, a lot later, Louis Althusser, who was a neo-Marxist philosopher in France, of all places, suggested that the identity of people is shaped by the state and by corporate interests through advertising. all three thinkers, although separated by decades, all three thinkers suggested that culture is a fiction. No such thing as culture. Culture is just interpellation. Interpellation means a series of messages conveyed by the state, conveyed by advertising companies on behalf of corporate clients, conveyed by the mass media, and nowadays conveyed by social media. And these messages, when you put them all together, you get a narrative, and this narrative is what we call culture. This is a very interesting view. However, it is, of course, counterfactual. It's counterfactual because it fails to take into account very critical dimensions of culture. For example, history, common history. For example, consensus. Culture has to be consensual. So it's a negotiated artifice. It's a negotiated pact. It's what Rousseau called the social contract. So it's a reductionist view that doesn't capture too many elements of culture. Still, I'm mentioning these thinkers because when we discuss intercultural communication, all of us, no exception, even Sinisha, make a few hidden assumptions. First of all, the assumption number one is that cultures are different, that cultures can be distinguished from each other. There is culture A, there's culture B, there's culture of Macedonia, there's culture of Israel, where I come from, and they are not the same. They are different. It's an assumption. It's not necessarily reality, as we will see in a minute. There is a second hidden assumption, that intercultural communication is a beneficial, good thing. We need it. We should strive to communicate between cultures. As individuals, we should bring our culture to the table, but we should attempt to create a common language with individuals from other cultures. And that would be a good thing, a beneficial thing. Now, I happen to think this way, but I want to warn you that there are many, many prominent scholars who do not think this way. They do not think that friction between cultures, communication between cultures is a good thing. They think that multiculturalism is a very bad thing which leads to conflict inexorably. I don't belong in this camp. I belong in the camp that believes that communication is essential to prevent conflict. But this is not the universal view. This is not even the dogma. There is a huge debate on multiculturalism, intercultural communication, and cross-cultural communication. Just a clarification, what is the difference between cross-cultural communication and intercultural communication? Cross-cultural communication studies the interaction between cultures via the medium of language, whereas intercultural communication studies the interaction between individuals which come from different cultures and attempt to create a common substrate, a common language for communication. So there is a huge debate. Now, the debate is not new at all. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was an obscure scholar by the name of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud coined the phrase Narcissism of small differences. Sigmund Freud suggested that the more people communicate, the more they assimilate, the more they imitate each other, the more they attempt to reach a common ground, the more they end up hating each other. He said that the smaller the differences between people, the greater the narcissism, the greater the sense of entitlement, the greater the fear, xenophobia, the greater, not the lesser. This is very reminiscent of work by a Japanese roboticist by the name of Masahiro Mori. Masahiro Mori in 1970 came up with the concept of the uncanny valley reaction. Masahiro Mori said that when robots would come to resemble human beings almost completely, almost perfectly, when robots would become androids, like in the famous movie Blade Runner, at that point, people would feel acutely uncomfortable. People would feel extremely anxious, not because the robots don't look like people, but because the robots do look like people. In short, I'm demonstrating to you that there is a long intellectual tradition, not only in the West, but even in countries like Japan, which is by definition more xenophobic than many countries in the West. But there is a long intellectual tradition that emphasizes that people from different cultures, and definitely cultures as a whole, should avoid interaction, should avoid communication, because this would lead to conflict. This is not the tradition I belong to. Absolutely not. But for the sake of academic rigor and honesty, I have to expose you to these views as well. One mistake we all make is the assumption that cultures are monolithic. When we ask the questions, are cultures different to each other? We confuse this question with the question, are cultures homogeneous? Now, don't confuse these two questions. They are not related. When you ask, is a culture homogeneous, you are asking about the internal structure of the culture. When you're asking if a culture is monolithic, you're asking about the internal structure of the culture. When you're asking if cultures are different, you're asking about multiple cultures, the external, the public-facing aspect of cultures. So this is not the same question. Cultures are not monolithic, of course. We know this. We know about subcultures, cultures of minorities, for example. And we have the work of Mark Orbe, or ORBE, and the co-cultural theory. Co-cultural theory is very interesting, and my time is limited. I cannot go into each and every one of the theories I'm going to mention. I'm going to mention quite a few. You may wish to do so on your own. Today, you have the whole human knowledge at your fingertips if you're sufficiently lucky to own a smartphone. Cultures, therefore, are not monolithic. They are broken into many, many subcultures, and they also change. We could change with time, change in reaction to external events, change in reaction to internal stresses, change because of new knowledge and new information, change because of circumstances and events. Cultures change all the time. The United States of the 1850s has nothing to do with the United States of the 1980s, for example. So cultures are heterogeneous, not homogeneous, and cultures are protean. Protean means ever-changing, ever-transforming. And because cultures are heterogeneous and because they change all the time, what is it that we're talking about? What is this entity that we are talking about? In a historical view, there are no cultures. In a historical view, there are cocktails and mixtures of influences owing to invasions, media exposure, literature, art, immigration. All these things affect the character of cultures. And so gradually what we see, starting at the beginning of the 20th century with the first wave of globalization, I don't know if you know, but by all economic measures, the world was much more globalized in 1910 than today. Globalization was much more pervasive in 1910 than today. So we are living through the second wave of globalization. These two waves of globalization created what we call cultural convergence. Cultural convergence. There is a reduction in cultural diversity. There is an increase in intercultural understanding and communication. This doesn't always have good impacts, doesn't always end well. But the fact is that we are exposed to other cultures like never before, with one exception, the beginning of the 20th century. I will give you one example where intercultural communication can lead to bad outcomes. Immigration. You see an example when immigrants immigrate to another country, you have coercive intercultural communication. You know, if you're in the United States, the grocery store is owned by a South Korean. You have to adopt. You have to learn about South Korea. You have to accept the culture of the other. There are issues of otherness, othering, issues of alterity. I don't know if you're acquainted with these concepts. But immigration forces you to communicate interculturally. But you see the outcomes in Europe. You see the rise of the far right. You see what's happening in the United States with the forced deportations and new concentration camps. So another example is the Jews. The Jews in the 19th century did everything they could to assimilate, to become Germans, to become French. There was a movement in Jewish history, the movement of assimilation. And this new integration of the Jews in non-Jewish society led to a rise in anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust. So we should be very careful with intercultural communication. Like every human invention, it could be abused. It could lead to bad outcomes if it is mismanaged, if it is forced on people, as has been the case in the United States, for example, where intercultural communication was dictated to people. It was doctrinaire. It was a doctrine. It was a dogma. And people had to succumb, had to obey. And the result was a rebellion in the United States and the Trump Revolution. So we will discuss intercultural communication. Always bear in mind that it's a very delicate process. It should always be voluntary. It should involve positive effects, positive emotions, such as empathy. It should trigger traits such as curiosity. We should do it in a way that appeals to people. We shouldn't come from high above, for example, from academe, and say, this is the way you should behave. You should interact with other people from other cultures. And if you don't do that, you're a bigot and you're a racist and you are subhuman, which is the message that comes from many universities and higher education institutions the world over and created a lot of hate for academe all over the world. Having said that cultures are heterogeneous, and that they are protean, they're changing all the time, I still want to propose some kind of typology, some kind of taxonomy of cultures, which will then allow us to deal with the topic of intercultural communication on terra firma, on some firm ground. Yeah? I suggest that there are three types of cultures. We have shame-based cultures. These cultures are preoccupied with signaling. Members of this culture all the time are concerned with their reputation. They're obsessed with reputation. And so what they do most of the time, they signal to each other. They signal verbally, non-verbally, body language, socially. There's a lot of signaling, virtue signaling, power signaling. These are signaling-based cultures. And the main effect, the main emotion there is shame, reputational cost. Reputational cost are the main tools of social control. The second type of culture is a solutions-orientated culture. culture that is based on consensus, on attaining goals, culture that is pragmatic and practical, culture that is not ideological, a culture that does not obey or succumb to narratives, but a culture that focuses on what's the problem, let's solve it. One example is the Netherlands. That's the culture of the Netherlands, used to be, until recently. That's the culture of the Netherlands. This has been the culture of the United States until more or less the 1950s, late 1950s. And so this is solution-orientated culture. And the third type of culture is the dominance, the hegemonic dominance culture that is obsessed with dominating other people, controlling, having power, exercising power, defining the environment, and so on and so forth. These are cultures that are hegemonic, as I said, but they also can easily become genocidal or engage in war crimes and so on. So these are cultures of dominance or elimination. These are the three types of cultures that I propose. I think we could fit almost any country that I know of to one of the three, but it is important to understand that these are not fixed entities. The same country can start with a shame-based country, or same society, sorry, can start with a shame-based society and then transition to a dominance society. The reaction to shame could be aggression. So you start with shame, and then to compensate for the shame, you become aggressive. An excellent example is Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, after the Versailles Treaty, after 1919, was a shame-based society. The Germans were horribly ashamed of their defeat in World War I, of the Versailles Treaty, of everything. And how did they react? They transitioned to a dominance-based culture, to an aggressive culture, going back to their roots, actually, the Prussian roots. So these are not fixed entities. Every society in history went through all three models. Now, what are the goals? Having established the scene, having set the scene, what are the goals of intercultural communication? I think the first goal is respect. It is easy to disrespect other people, especially in today's narcissistic civilization, where everyone thinks that he's a genius and everyone thinks she's a god. It's very difficult to respect other people. Today, the organizing principle of modern society is not dignity. It's either victimhood or contempt. You could either have contempt towards other people, or you could declare yourself a victim. This is the observation by Campbell, the sociologist, not me. So respect is a rare commodity nowadays. We don't really respect other people, even within our culture. When people come from other cultures, we tend to have two possible reactions. Or we become self-denigrating, submissive. We become self-critical, harshly self-critical, because we regard the other culture as superior. After the transition from communism in Eastern Europe, many people in Eastern Europe felt inferior to the West. They were criticizing themselves, denigrating themselves, and idealizing and idolizing the West. That's an example. So that's not a way to establish respect or maintain it. Respect is among equals, never among inferior and superior. So the first goal of intercultural communication is respect, and this is known as communicative accommodation. That's a professional term for this. Communicative accommodation is just another name for code switching. Code switching is a concept in clinical psychology, or more precisely, in communication psychology. Code switching is when I talk to someone and then I want to secure beneficial outcomes, I want to secure good outcomes, so I begin to talk the other person's language. it doesn't have to be another language, but the other person's speech pattern, I begin to imitate the other person. I switch my code. I switch from my code to the other person's code. So respect demands a little code switching, a little accommodation of communication, communicative accommodation. Respect requires to recognize the other as representative of a whole world, of a whole universe, of concepts and beliefs and values and history and autobiography and to be curious about the other person and to accept that the other person can teach you something, not to be grandiose. There's nothing I can learn. My culture is so superior. These are savages. What can I learn from them? The way Donald Trump talks about Africa, for example. I spent 4 years in Africa. He has a lot to learn, believe me. So respect is, I think, the first goal of intercultural communication. The second goal is efficacy. Efficacy, for example, in business. Imagine a multinational that does business in Japan and in Russia and in Israel and in Netherlands and in Australia and so on, in Brazil. This kind of multinational company, they need to be culturally sensitive in order to be efficacious. The outcome of intercultural communication, this has been proven in many studies. When intercultural communication is good, the outcomes for everyone involved are optimized. Much better. Not maximized, but optimized. Intercultural communication is like oil in the machine. It allows people to work together without the friction that engenders conflict and a waste of resources. It's less wasteful. And so we have concepts here, and I'm just giving you the concepts. We don't have time, unfortunately, so you can look them up online.
Okay,
when we discuss...
Sorry, Sam, just 4 minutes, please, because if you can be more concise in 4 minutes, and later I would like to ask the students to ask you questions, because we have scheduled with the lecture.
I'm not sure I can do it in 4 minutes, but I will see what I can do. You said that I have 25, 30 minutes. Did I use them already?
Yes.
I did? Wow. Bad example of intercultural communication. Or bad example of communication. So concepts like cultural agility, cultural simulation, cultural sensitivity, cultural adaptation, and so on and so forth. The optimal outcome of intercultural communication is fusion. It's when you can accommodate 2 or more cultures in your mind. You can put together a few cultures in your mind and not feel that you're estranged, not feel strange about it. The language here is critical. Language is critical in intercultural communication because it's communication, of course. There is a problem with meaning. We very often misinterpret the meaning of words, even in our own language, in our own culture, let alone in other cultures. There is a theory, it's called the meaning of meanings theory. And it's one of the foundational theories in intercultural communication. So the encoding, the reference of the words is very important. The media of transmission is important. The interpretation is important because sometimes we know the referent, we know the lexical meaning, but we don't understand the hidden text. We cannot interpret. There's what we call a hermeneutic failure. So the interpretation is very important. And collaboration, of course. The mechanisms of intercultural communication involve anxiety reduction. Intercultural communication reduces anxiety if it is done properly, if it is not coerced, if it is not forced. It reduces communication, it's anxiolytic, because it reduces uncertainty. When you don't know the other person, when you don't know the other culture, it's easy to become paranoid, easy to become hypervigilant, easy to imagine all kinds of threats. The more you know the other, the more certain you are. And even if there is a threat, you are less anxious because you have certainty. Assimilation is another mechanism. So in some countries, for example, France, for example, the United States, they expect immigrants to lose their culture, to become assimilated. They expect immigrants to adopt the dominant hegemonic culture. That's why, for example, the current regime in the United States, the current administration, is trying to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs because they preserve the cultures of minorities, immigrants, and so on. And this goes against the grain of the philosophy of the United States as a melting pot. Same in Israel, by the way. Same in Israel. There is another mechanism, which is deviance. Deviance is rebellion. Sometimes intercultural communication reaches a dead end. We can get nowhere. And this creates defiance and contumaciousness. Contumaciousness means rejection of authority. And then we have a psychopathic reaction, basically, which is in the form of rebellion. No, I'm not kidding. This is clinically an antisocial reaction. Deviance, of course, is a psychological term. And finally, we have alienation. The best work on alienation is Hajda. It's not alienation in terms of Marx, which is economic alienation. It's alienation in sociological terms. Intercultural communication can lead to any of these outcomes. It can reduce anxiety, it can lead to assimilation, it can lead to deviance, and it can lead to alienation. So it can end badly and it could end very well. Depends crucially how it's managed. Finally, because Sinisha, I'm afraid of Sinisha, so finally, I will mention the number one major theory in intercultural communication today, and it is the culture-based conflict situation model. Actually, there are several models. There are already three or four that I can think of, starting in 2001. The culture-based conflict situation models, the first one was suggested by Tink Toomey and Özzel in 2001. And this theory deals with all the aspects of intercultural communication, the primary orientation, boundary conditions, conflict, and so on. It's very beautiful theory. I think it captures and encapsulates everything we know on the topic. The competing theory was proposed by a student, believe it or not, in her PhD dissertation. And her name is Sorrells. And it is known as the intercultural praxis model. And this theory says that intercultural communications, when it goes through 6 stages described in the model, is always successful and always beneficial. I'm sorry I don't have more time. I could talk about this topic for years and decades and so on, but you're too young. I will never do this to you. So here we are. If you have any questions, queries, disagreements, or whatever, I'm all ears, as you can see.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam, for the very good, deep presentation, and I think very useful for the students. So now I would ask for the students if they have some questions for you regarding your presentation, regarding your speech. So they can ask you now, or if they are not prepared now, maybe they can send me the message, and I will connect you in order for some other deeper
my email address in the institute is vakninsam, that's my name, vakninsam at ciaps.org, because it's an institute.
Okay, so, I will write it. You can write me on the WhatsApp, and I will put it in the message. Okay, students, this is the floor. Now it's yours. If you have some questions for Professor Dr. Sam Vaknin.
Sam, call me Sam. It's like in marriage, in a marriage ceremony, you know, the pastor he says, if anyone knows any reason that these two should not get married, say it now or forever hold your peace. Okay, say it now or send it by email.
Okay.
What do
Uh,
you think? What do you think? Let me help you. What do you think about the thesis that intercultural communication is not always good? What do you
Yeah.
honestly think about?
Mr. Sam, I wanted to ask you a question. What's your personal opinion? Like, if we're talking about immigrants moving from one country to another, and provided that the two cultures may be different, what is the reasonable balance between, integration into the new society and preservation of the roots?
This has to do with another area of psychosociology that studies known as alterity studies, alterity or othering studies. Yeah, and there we ask the question: what exposure to the other? When I say the other, means foreigners, immigrants, the minorities, the other. Even when if you're a man, the other is a woman. If you're an adult, the other is a child. Everything that is not you. So they deal with the question an exposure to the other, how to manage it, what are the best outcomes, how to prevent conflict, and what are we doing wrong. So we know already, for example, that if we just put people together randomly, especially in cities, cities are like pressure cookers. If we put people together randomly with no preparation, no introduction, no nothing, no education, it's going to end badly. We know that. Second thing we know is that immigrants tend to work in jobs which the indigenous population usually does not want to work in. But this is true only at the beginning. Later on, immigrants do take manufacturing jobs from the local population. They compete for manufacturing jobs. Not at the beginning, after 5 years, 10 years, and so on. But they compete for manufacturing jobs. So we know that immigration, if it is not controlled numerically, quantitatively, and qualitatively, if it's not controlled, would lead to friction between population groups owing to scarce resources. But surprisingly, what we discovered is that while there's a lot of economic friction and so on, the main point of friction is culture, main, different values and so on. And we distinguish between three types of conflict. The first type is known as doxastic conflict. Doxastic conflict is when the beliefs of the immigrants are not the same as the beliefs of the local population. For example, Muslims have a different view of gender roles, family values, and so on than most of the population in Germany or Netherlands. Yeah. So here we have the roots of a doxastic conflict. Another type of conflict is axiological conflict. Axiological conflict is when the values, not the beliefs, but the values are different. So, for example, you could have a society where the individual is inferior to the collective, should sacrifice himself or herself to the collective. And you could have a society where it's exactly the opposite. The individual's main role is to challenge the collective and to modify the collective and so on. So if you bring Japanese to the United States, this, as we all know, ended up badly in the 1940s. This is an axiological conflict. So and then finally we have what we call a deontic conflict. So these are the three types. Deontic conflict means that there is a different perception of behavior, of what is right, what is wrong, what is desirable, what is not desirable. So, for example, you could have a society where working too much is considered wrong. You should dedicate time to your family. You should not work so much. And you have a society where if you don't work enough, you're a lazy slacker. So that would create conflict. There are many, as I'm demonstrating to you, there are many possibilities for conflict. And they are not merely economic. When you bring people, you need to think about these issues. Are the values compatible? Are the beliefs compatible? Is the perception of life, eudaimonia, the good life, is the perception of the good life in Aristotelian terms? Is this perception compatible? And I personally, because you asked me personally now, I do not represent now Cambridge, or I represent me. Right now, I think it's a catastrophically bad idea to put together people who are incompatible as far as values, beliefs, and the perception of what constitutes a good life. A seriously bad idea, in my view, which always leads to very sad outcomes for everyone involved. And unfortunately, the West, let's put it this way, has opened its gates indiscriminately. No amount of intercultural communication will help you here. There is a belief that intercultural communication is like magic formula, panacea, it's not. On the contrary, sometimes when you get to know the other person's culture, you are even more disgusted than before. You are even more aggressive than before. You are even more,
Okay, thank you, Sam. Is there any other question? I can see not. Okay, I would like you to thank you, Sam, for your quite good lecture and quite good, a lot of information that you provided, not just for me, to the students. I hope they are very useful for them. And the main point why I invited you to be part of this lecture, because you have thoughts and something that will encourage people to think deeply about some issue, not just take like real true, but encourage people to see from different angles, because the most important thing is not just when you are communicating, just to take this view and say this is the right view. When you're doing some view or some thoughts, you should be aware that you should see from different angles.
Did you just notice that Sinisha used all the tools of intercultural communication beautifully? Beautifully. Because he could have said, you're provocative, you are this, but he put it so nicely and so gently that I even took it as a compliment. So this is an example of intercultural communication, which is communication actually, which is really, really good. I mean it, I'm not joking. It was really nicely done. Thank you, Sinisha.
Okay, we will continue with our presentation. Sam, you can stay on my lecture, or you can just leave.
I will have to say goodbye. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being patient.
Thank you very much. Thank you.